Welcome back. In our last session, we finished our discussion on the Bread of Life discourse, concentrating on the Johannine theology of the Eucharist as it's presented in that discourse, and then looking at the reactions to the discourse among those in the synagogue at Capernaum who heard it. The reaction basically was twofold, we discovered. Many thought it too much for them and ceased to follow Jesus. However, his inner circle chose to remain with him, as they saw that he had the words of everlasting life. In our current session, we shall look at Jesus' presence at yet another of the major feasts of the Jews, Tabernacles. We begin with a prelude concerning a dialogue between Jesus and his brothers on returning to Jerusalem for the feast. As an aside, we'll address the thorny question of just who these brothers of the Lord are. This will be followed by a discussion of the Feast of Tabernacles, what it is, and what the key images and symbols in use are. After his brothers depart for Jerusalem, we shall narrate Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and his initial work at the feast. This will be followed by an examination of Jesus' preaching during the central part or the middle of the feast. The final day of the feast will be considered in the next session. The discourse spans the 7th and 8th chapters of the Gospel of John. Between these chapters, at the beginning of chapter 8, there's an interlude concerning Jesus and the Jews who bring him a woman who has been caught in the act of adultery. We'll look at that interlude after we cover the final day in the next session. So, let's begin with Jesus and his brothers. The brothers of Jesus are introduced into the narrative at the beginning of chapter 7. Because of later doctrinal developments concerning the virginity of Mary, the identity of these brothers has been a thorny question in biblical scholarship. We'll examine the narrative of their introduction in John 7, and then take a look at who these brothers might actually be. The narrative begins with the simple connective, after these things. That is, after the events surrounding the Bread of Life discourse and its aftermath. Jesus is walking in Galilee because he did not wish to return, that is, walk, in Judea. Interesting that the same verb is used in both cases. This introduces a rather ominous note into the narrative of Tabernacles. Then a further reason is given. The Jews were seeking to kill him. This is a direct reference to the plan set forth in chapter 5, verse 18. In this gospel, the term Jews refers to the growing opposition to Jesus from the official ruling class of Judaism. They stand in opposition to the growing crowds who are following Jesus. Then we discover that a number of months have passed since chapter 6 ended. Chapter 6 ended shortly after the Passover in the spring of the year. Now the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near. Tabernacles was celebrated in the early autumn around the end of September. So we've jumped in time from around April to around September. Beasley Murray, drawing on the writings of Josephus, notes that, quote, Tabernacles was the most popular of the Jewish annual gatherings in the temple, close quote. The most holy and most eminent, as Josephus puts it. Enter the brothers, who are in dialogue with Jesus, saying, Depart from here. Go into Judea, so that your disciples may see your works, which you are doing. So on the surface, the brothers are warning Jesus to return to Judea in order to convert more followers. this is one of the major Jewish feasts. People from all over the world would be in Jerusalem as at Passover. The harvest of converts was ripe. The possibility even existed that some of those who departed him at the end of chapter 6 could be won back. So they counseled, he really ought to go up to Jerusalem. Then they give their reason for this advice. No one does anything in secret when he wants to be known publicly. Note, the brothers are urging Jesus on the basis of the signs he has done and he continues to do. If you are going to do these things, show yourself to the world. We already know from chapter 2 that belief based on signs is inadequate. So the brothers are urging him from the wrong motives. Then the editor confirms that what we as readers have been suspecting through the use of the Greek particle gar, which gives a reason. His brothers do not even believe in him. They're not wishing that he succeed, but exactly the opposite. They want him to return to Jerusalem to be publicly humiliated at the hands of the authorities. Perhaps that's the brothers' way of getting rid of him. But Jesus sees through their flattery and responds in words similar to the response to his mother at Cana. My time has not yet come, my kairos. The word used here for time is the same word, a significant word, kairos, which refers to opportune time or right time. It has no reference to the passing of time on a clock. So Jesus tells his brothers that it's not the right time for that journey. However, he continues, your time, your kairos, is always here. Their kairos to come to believe in him. Here Jesus is a bit countercultural. Popular thought felt that a person's time, kairos, was determined by fate. Jesus, on the other hand, sees his time, or kairos, determined, as all things in his life, by God. Beasley Murray has a very interesting comment on this. By contrast to Jesus, the kairos of the brothers of Jesus is always present. Since they neglect God's kairos, they determine their own lives, and so lead a meaningless existence in the world of which they are a part. As a result, Jesus continues, the world cannot hate you, but it does hate me. Then the reason, I witness concerning it, that its works are evil. The world's hatred, demonstrated in the Jews' plot, and the defection of the disciples that we saw at the end of chapter 6, is another way of showing that the world cannot take the truth that Jesus reveals to it. Jesus, the light, has shone on and in the world, and the world cannot take the light, preferring darkness, the darkness of its own small understanding. Let's take a moment to look at the question of just who these brothers who are so negative toward Jesus are. We'll begin with a look at the original language words for brother. In Hebrew and Aramaic, words have a much wider breadth of meaning than in Greek or English, because the vocabulary is much smaller. The Hebrew word for brother is ach, which primarily means a blood brother, but it also can be used to refer to a wider family, extended family, or cousins. So when one is referred to in Hebrew as ach, it could mean he is a blood brother, a half-brother, a step-brother, or a cousin. The Greek nuance is much more like the English. Adelphos, which is the Greek word for brother, means primarily blood brother. and occasionally can be used to refer to extended family. However, contrary to Hebrew, Greek is a perfectly good word to refer to cousins or extended family, that is, anepsios. So purists will say there's a perfectly good word for cousin. Why shouldn't the writer use it? The problem comes in translating from the Semitic, Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. Translations of the Hebrew ach can be literal as brother or according to sense, that is, cousin or extended family. The question is, what was the sense in the original text? So with that background in mind, let's look at the primary interpretations of the term brother in the early church. There are three possibilities that have been accepted among various denominations. The first was proposed by the writer Helvidius, hence it's known as the Helvidian solution. He held that these brothers were blood brothers of Jesus, children of Mary and Joseph. Clearly, in Catholic doctrine, that position would be considered heretical, as the Catholic Church teaches that Mary was perpetually a virgin. The Helvidian position is held by many of the evangelical churches. The second position was set forth by the church father Epiphanius, supported by Hegesippus and the apocryphal writing known as the Proto-Evangelium of James. It's known as the Epiphanian solution. He held that these brothers and sisters were children of Joseph by a previous marriage. Hence, they were stepchildren of Mary. This option adheres to the church doctrine and is the position held by many of the Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. The third position is that of St. Jerome in his writings against Helvidius. Hence, it's known as the Hieronymian solution, from the Greek form of Jerome. Jerome noted that the brothers and sisters were actually extended family or cousins of Jesus. This is the position that's held by the Western churches, most especially the Latin or Roman Catholic Church. It also adheres to church doctrine. So, our understanding of the identity of these brothers and sisters is that they are cousins. Those who object on linguistic grounds say since there is a perfectly good word for cousin, why not use it? When it comes to translation, it's not always that simple. In any case, the brothers are not portrayed in a very good light in any of the Gospels, which might suggest that being related by blood, they felt that they had more say than others in the workings of the community after Jesus had ascended. Now back to the text of John. In response to the suggestion of the brothers that he go up to Jerusalem, Jesus is clear. You go up to the feast yourselves. I am not going up to the feast, because my time has not yet been fulfilled. Jesus is emphatic, reiterating the fact that his time, his kairos, has not yet come. The author notes that when he made this dramatic climactic statement, then he remained in Galilee. Presumably, the brothers went up to the feast. The remainder of chapter 7 and the entire of chapter 8 concerns Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles. The narrative is generally divided into three parts: the early part of the feast, the middle of the feast, and the last day of the feast. Through each of these sections, tensions are rising between Jesus and the authorities of Judaism until they reach grand proportions on the final day of the feast. Yet, another short interlude about the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, Sukkoth, as it's known in Hebrew, is appropriate here. Maloney tells us that Tabernacles was the most popular of the three pilgrimage feasts, Passover, Tabernacles, and Weeks. It's known as the Feast of Yahweh, or simply the Feast. During the harvesting in the fall, usually a period of 8 days, the Jewish people would stay near the fields in tents or booths, Sukkoth in Hebrew, hence the name of the feast. Originally, it was a feast of thanksgiving for a good harvest of wine, fruit, or olives. Later, this was given theological import as a remembrance of God's mercy during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness narrated in the book of Numbers. But also, it became an anticipation of the coming of the Lord at the second Exodus, when the kingdom of God would arrive. So the feast looked backward at what God has done for his people and forward to what God will do in the future. Traditionally, the feast began on the 15th day of the 7th month, that is Tishri, when tabernacles or tents were built to house them during the harvest, but also to recall the tent experience of the Israelites in the desert, being totally in the care of God. This sleeping in tents lasted 7 days, which was followed by a grand celebration in which on the 8th day they recalled the protection that God gave his people during the period of the Exodus. Three major elements form the ritual of the celebration: water, light, and the temple itself. Each morning of the feast, a procession would make its way down to the pool of Siloam to gather water in a golden container. Then a great procession would wend its way back to the temple, entering through the water gate to the altar of the temple, where the priest would pour the water into 2 vessels, allowing it to flow out onto the altar. It was then thought that the tabernacles would play a key part in the appearance of the Messiah. A second major element was light. Maloney tells us that 4 menorahs, candelabras, were set up in the center of the court of the women. In the tractate Sukkoth of the Mishnah, we read that, quote, pious men and wonder workers would dance before them with flaming torches in their hand, and they would sing before them songs and praises. Mishnah Sukkot 5:4. Maloney further notes that this may recall the pillar of fire that led Israel through the wilderness. Later traditions hold that the pillar of fire was to return at the end of time. Thus, citing Talbert, Maloney concludes that both the water ritual and the light ceremony help connect the Feast of Tabernacles to the end times. The third major element was known as the rite of facing the temple. This again is drawn from the Mishnah. During the early morning watch on each of the days of booths, the priests proceeded to the east gate of the temple and gazed away from the temple to the east. When they could see the sun rising, they turned around so that their backs were to the sun, and they faced the temple sanctuary, and they prayed. Our fathers, when they were in this place, turned with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun to the east. But as for us, our eyes are turned toward the Lord." Unquote. This echoed the final words of the Hallel Psalm sung during the procession with the water. As Maloney notes, "You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, and I will extol you. O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." So God was recognized as the one true God, to whom all praise and all allegiance were due. Here's a map of the city of Jerusalem. The Pool of Siloam is located toward the bottom right of the lower city. The large rectangular area just above the lower city is the Temple Mount. The procession with water made its way up from the Pool of Siloam to the temple area. Trust me, up is up. The altitude of the temple area is much higher than the pool, so to walk from Siloam to the temple area is a steep, uphill walk. I know, I've done it a number of times. This picture gives us a hint of what the route might have looked like in the first century. At the bottom right of the picture is the Pool of Siloam, designated by an arrow. The procession would then follow the route designated by the second arrow to the gates, the south gates, or the Hulda gates of the temple. So, concluding our interlude on the origin and history of the Feast of Tabernacles, we return to the narrative. After all the protests about going up to the feast when his brothers went up to the feast, Jesus also decides that he will go up to the feast, not openly, but in secret. Joanne Brandt notes that this action of Jesus may be offensive to some moderns, but in the context of the Mediterranean world, such near deception can be viewed as almost admirable. The Jews were expecting Jesus to be at the feast, and when he seemingly was not, they began to ask, "Where is that one?" So perhaps the brothers were right. In any case, the Jews were continually murmuring about Jesus, and their murmuring or muttering was an indication of division among them. On the one hand, some said this one was good. On the other hand, they were saying he can't be good because he's leading the crowds astray. He causes us to wander. This is precisely the charge that was preserved for centuries in an account of Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud. It says, "It was taught, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu as an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days, saying he's going to be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed and led all Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead on his behalf." Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a. The narrator adds a comment that no one spoke openly about him because they feared the Jews. This is a classic technique for creating suspense. The fear of the crowd is described, and its effect, that is, silence. But we never find out what the object of that fear was. What we end up with is a climate of repression in which frank speech seems rather dangerous. The narrative then moves quickly to the middle of the feast. And again, there's a question of Jesus' origins and the origins and sources of his teaching. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went into the temple area, the Hieron, as opposed to the Naos, as we explained earlier, and he was teaching. We're not told what the content of Jesus' teaching was, as that's not the problem. The fact that he's teaching is the problem. Nevertheless, Jesus' teaching leads to amazement on the part of those who hear. Their amazement leads them to ask, how does this one know letters, not having learned through instruction? Put simply, how does he know so much when he's never gone to school? In the ancient world, one is considered as knowledgeable who has sat at the feet of a master and soaked in his wisdom. The crowd seems to know that Jesus did not have such a master or mentor. So how does he know so much? So they want to know his mentor, and he tells them, "My teaching is not mine, but of the one who sent me." However, instead of listing a long line of previous rabbis as authority, Jesus goes to appealing to his Father, claiming direct knowledge from God. Once again, Jesus reiterates the general principle that he does not act on his own, but rather he acts on the authority of his Father. And his main concern is to do the Father's will. That is again the first principle of agency we noted earlier. So Jesus says, if someone should wish to do the will of him that is God, he will know regarding my teaching, whether it is from God that I speak or from myself on my own authority. When one opts to do God's will, they will know that Jesus does God's will, and his teaching is from God. Jesus continues the argument. The one speaking from his own authority seeks his own glory. He wants people to see how intelligent he is, inventing his own ideas. However, the one seeking the glory of the one who sent him, this one is true, and there is no injustice in him. The ancient world had no use for ideas that were unique to an individual. The invention of an individual was not knowledge or insight. All thought had to fit the community. Hence, rabbis always taught on the authority of other rabbis, never on their own authority. Thus, authentic teaching, which is in line with divine order or justice, always is in line with the tradition of the predecessors. So Jesus turns to his predecessors. Did not Moses give you the law? The hearers must necessarily answer this in the positive. However, Jesus then turns their answer against them. In a shocking accusation, he says, no one from you does or keeps or performs that law. If they did, they would understand Jesus. But as it is, they don't understand him, and they wish to eliminate him. And so Jesus asks, why do you seek to kill me? We've heard on several occasions of the plan of the leaders to eliminate Jesus. The crowd, however, who engaged Jesus here seems to be oblivious to that plan. Thus, their response is understandable. You have a demon. You're possessed. Who seeks to kill you? Jesus chooses not to go the route that they're suggesting. Rather, he answers, I have done one work, and you were amazed. On account of this, most interpreters see that one work as the cure of the paralytic at the pools of Bethzatha, which we discussed earlier. The people were amazed that he cured a man ill for such a long time, and he cured him on the Sabbath. The authorities vowed to kill him for that violation of the law. From this, Jesus draws a further comparison. They violate the law continually by circumcision of a boy whose 8th day of life falls on the Sabbath. Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath day you circumcise a man. The mention of the fathers, that is, the patriarchs, shows that circumcision is a practice older than Moses. It goes back to Abraham and the period of the patriarchs. Jesus now uses rabbinic argumentation from a lesser to a greater in order to justify his one work. A man can receive circumcision, which affects only one part of the man on a Sabbath. In fact, if the 8th day falls on the Sabbath, must receive circumcision, so that the law of Moses will not be broken. So are they upset because he cured a whole person on the Sabbath? The saving of the entire body certainly counts for more. Around the time of the writing of John's Gospel, Rabbi Eleazar writes, "Now, if on account of a single limb of a person they override the prohibitions of the Sabbath, is it not logical that one should override the prohibitions of the Sabbath on account of the saving of the whole of him?" Shabbat 15:15. Therefore they're to judge honestly and reasonably, and not by what they see or what they hear. Their judgment must be just, that is, according to the spirit of the law, its true meaning. Jesus may have violated the letter of the Sabbath law, but he did it to save a whole human being. Now, a discussion of the origins of Jesus now follows. Some of the inhabitants of Jerusalem question whether he was the one whom the authorities wanted to kill. How is it possible that he speaks freely and openly, and they allow him? One possible answer to their dilemma is that the authorities have realized that he is the Christ. But that's not plausible, as the crowd knows, as they suppose, where Jesus is from, that is, Nazareth. When the Messiah comes, no one knows his origins. Then Jesus responds, speaking in response to their query on his origins. This leads to an attempt to subdue Jesus by the crowd, yet it was unsuccessful, because his hour had not yet come. On the positive side, many in the crowd did believe in him, since the Messiah would probably not do more than Jesus has been doing. The upheaval in the crowd leads the Jews to send guards to arrest Jesus. He then addresses the crowd in his usual cryptic way. "You will look for me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." The Jews question what he means by that statement. Some think he might be traveling to the diaspora to teach the Greeks. The discussion ends with the question, where is he going, left unanswered. Well, that's about all the time we have in this session. We'll have to let the rest of the story of Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles go until next time. The argument is heating up, and it will boil over on the last and greatest day of the feast. See you then.